On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Dave Kaplan. He is the head of engineering at Policygenius. We're going to be covering a topic today that centers around balancing team velocity and quality. Dave's been in engineering management for quite a while, and I'm really excited to get his view on this. Dave, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And I know we're joking that your responsibility there keeps growing, but you're responsible for delivering all things engineering at Policygenius. Maybe just as a little context, can you tell us what Policygenius does?
I used to say that we were in, one of the top insurance marketplaces because we're insurance tech. I guess I could say we're one of the top financial security marketplaces because this year we added on estate planning. But primarily, we work with our customers to get them the right fit for life insurance, which has been the bread and butter of the company for years. As of 2019, property and casualty insurance as well. And then as of this year, a will through an estate planning product. And we are an end-to-end solution. This is not lead generation. We have the sales, case management, customer support to get you the whole way through what usually is a pretty, arduous process.
Awesome. Very interesting business model. And we'll link to Dave's background. You guys can go through the show notes and find his LinkedIn to kind of take a deep dive of his background to kind of go along with the podcast. I guess with the topic today, we're talking about balancing team velocity and having to obviously correlate that to quality. The old adage, you can have it fast, good, cheap. Pick two of those. It's very difficult to get all three. Speed and quality typically go in opposite directions of each other. Not necessarily something that goes hand in hand, but you're tasked with delivering, and through your career, delivering solutions, right? That's what you have to do. I guess maybe start at the top in terms of, when you're sitting down and looking at, what might fit into sprint and you understand what a team is doing and how you're kind of in your mind envisioning. Again, I don't know if you guys are Agile, Scrum, or what methodology you're using, but what you're trying to view as what velocity a team can establish and how you're observing that over time.
So just to answer part of your question, you talked about, you're not sure whether we're, Scrum or Agile, and it's probably useful for people listening to understand what we're talking about here. So I'll throw out a bunch of buzzwords. We are an Agile Scrum shop, a fairly strict form of Scrum, not dogmatic, but we do use all of the parts, the different ceremonies. We are also dual track in the Marty Kagan inspired kind of fashion, where we believe that, Scrum and delivery and Agile is really a component in service of an experiment-driven discovery process, which then also leads us towards, and there's an Agile principle, autonomous teams that are fully embedded with product managers, designers, engineers, even recently this year, data analysts, data scientists as well. I think the other angle is also talking about the delivery process, especially when we're talking about quality and velocity. And we are CI and approaching CD. That's something we're working on right now. And we are big believers in DevOps culture. That's not a completely centralized, DevOps, quote unquote, DevOps team, but a DevOps culture where we're moving towards owning their architectures and moving towards as much automation as possible. Maybe I'll even say we're approaching DevSecOps, since we're big believers in built-in security and also shifting that left as well. I think your original question was around what is the weekly sprint like, or, how does that play into velocity? And so when you're approaching it from the Scrum angle, there is this idea of, being as uninterrupted as possible during the sprint, but committing to goals and really measuring your success somewhat based on your predictability, as well as, to take it an additional layer, your metrics that align to CI/CD and DevOps within that. And that's something we can go deeper in. But that's one of the ways we approach, velocity and quality. And I think, that's not a novel approach. This is something that is definitely done in the industry. Getting it right is really, really hard, and maintaining it might even be harder.
I guess the interesting thing with that is, obviously through Scrum, the team is determining, they're voting, points based, they're determining what they can do, they're committing to it. The team's trying to be self-governing and self-managed. Meanwhile, you're sitting there watching this, and you're looking at the burn down. You're looking at overall workload they can take on as a manager when you're no longer committed to delivering code, but you're watching this the chicken and the pig scenario here. What is your thoughts if the team is trying to bite off more than they can chew? Or, do you need to step in and go, hey, listen, guys, I think we're taking on more than we can deliver? And what does that look like?
That's a great question. And I will say, like, and maybe to step back again, I'll throw a few more buzzwords at the risk of sounding like a industry machine here. We really are striving for autonomy. So we really try to do as little of what you said as possible, and getting really the people closest to the problem, solving the problem, which, are aspects of generative culture and things like that. I will say that a lot, just to also give people a frame of reference, and maybe even something that if they want to take away and look at, a lot of what I talk about and what I believe in is fairly derivative of things like the DevOps report, and also really Accelerate by Nicole Forsgren, which has just been in a monumental book in the industry that I think has probably made some of the biggest changes in the industry that I've seen over the past 3-4 years because of her quantitative approach. And what did she find, right? She found that if you focus on things like transformational leadership, generative culture, autonomy, she did find certain metrics you can look at with CI/CD. Then what you do is you create teams that can monitor their own effectiveness and can find the multitude of issues that can cause some very simple symptoms like not being predictable, which is something that when you're mentioning, like, hey, do you have to rein teams in because you think they're setting themselves up for failure? The symptom there is really that they're not being predictable, because that's what it's going to end up being. And what we believe is that, okay, let teams have small failures, which will allow them to learn, and then find what the problems are specifically for their teams and adjust. And I can give a brief example before I take a breath. I started here in 2018, and one of the big problems that was identified by the engineering team themselves, but also, of course, by product management, was something vague about velocity issues, right? The PMs thought we could go faster, and the teams themselves did, because they were not hitting their sprint goals and they didn't feel good about it. It was hurting the morale of the team. And we did change the problem. We said, okay, it's actually, velocity is historically a really difficult thing to measure and to hit for, because it's different on every teams. And how do you measure the velocity of something that is where every task is just very, very different from sprint to sprint? So we reframed it as, velocity will come, but let's start with predictability, right? How do we get to what is really an industry benchmark of being within 80% predictable, with one or two good sprint goals that we really think with that 80% confidence that we can hit. And we went after that, which is a single symptom. And every team, by the way, was having this problem. Within 6 months, every single team was within that 80% predictable. But the things they were solving were all very different. Some teams, it was, as you indicated, it was the way they were pointing. Maybe they were underestimating, which was causing them to take on too much. Some teams, it was about capacity. They really weren't estimating the capacity they would actually have. Maybe simple things like taking into account engineering on call work or emergency work or holidays. Sometimes more complex things like, what does it mean when you've got a new engineer and how much should they count towards your capacity? So there's really a multitude of issues. And, going back to those tried and true, philosophy of autonomy, we realized that if we gave the teams enough information, we gave them access to experience, which is very important, right? Because if you have a totally junior team, they may flail and they may not know how to fix the problem. But if you give them access to people who can coach, then they start to have really good conversations, really productive conversations. They start to build trust in meetings like retrospectives, and they can put together a very custom plan for themselves to get themselves to the right place. And that happened ubiquitously for us in 2018 or 2019, rather.
Interesting. Were you seeing, I guess, maybe when we're looking historical now, when you were examining that, was the team potentially maybe confusing, Epic for a story and just picking too big of what they could fit into a sprint? Was that at all happening?
Absolutely. I mean, that always happens.
Got so hard.
What's the idea? I think it's called elephant carpaccio, right? How do you slice up these big nuggets into, thin vertical slices? It's horrible imagery, but that's what I learned it's called. Yeah, it happens all the time. And sometimes, you chunk things up very small, but they are not thinly sliced. They're not thin vertical slices, and you wind up paying for it down the road. That's happened to us a couple times. And every time we think we learned our lesson, it pops up on a different team. So yeah, very, very important. Also incredibly difficult. Engineers tend to think of things more in the technical terms. if you're reading it by the book, you're supposed to think of it in vertical slices according to like releasables or user stories. And so bridging the gap, it definitely takes some practice and experience.
As much as the numbers, the analytics behind it look like there's a lot of science, the art of actually navigating through Scrum is very unique. I guess the question I was going to ask you, since maybe we're talking about a little bit of what was happening in 2018. So the team was obviously not delivering, for various reasons, and I guess we were going to talk about quality as well. When you have a team that may be trying to deliver too much, and maybe there's some technical debt that's being added, and they need to go back and fix it in a subsequent sprint, and that starts affecting velocity differently than just not picking the right amount of work that you can fit into whatever your sprint length potentially was.
It's an interesting point. And one thing I want to say to make a distinction is not that they weren't delivering. They were. And honestly, the quality of the work was great.
Sure.
But when you have a mismatch in predictability where, okay, here's our commitment for the next 2 weeks, and you consistently miss that, it really, really puts a wrench in for the product managers and for the designers who are trying to, which is a really tough thing to do in Agile, but really trying to manage stakeholder commitments. You have to work with a marketing team where, sometimes you do have deadlines because there's big campaigns and they have to launch at different times, but you're trying to paradoxically, have that work with Agile, which is much more iterative. And so it's really difficult if you can't even predict out the risks, right? I think, Agile, they tell you have between 2 to 3 sprints groomed, right, and ready to go. But if you can't rely on that, even within, 80%, it makes your job very, very difficult. It can be very frustrating. On the other hand, it also just creates lots of morale implications for the engineers who are probably still delivering really good work, but because they're always struggling to make that deadline, we all know that there's this endorphin hit when you finally get it, right? And you hit it. And, at some companies I work for, you get to ring a gong, and a lot of that's missing. So even that simple thing of like, we had one team that was just consistent. I would say it was probably 9 out of 10 sprints. They were missing the sprint goal. They actually became 6 months later our most predictable team. And just externally watching the morale improve was huge. Going back to the tech debt thing, and this was actually the problem with this team, was they had a very complex code base. They had a lot of engineers who didn't understand the full breadth of it. So their ability to estimate it was very limited reliably. And what would be maybe a 1-pointer for one person on the team might be a 4-pointer for somebody else because they were much newer or unfamiliar. And then also to your point, you talked about accumulating the tech debt because there was so much complexity and because they didn't have a full grasp on it. They were unwittingly accumulating tech debt that they either had to immediately pay down or was causing them extensibility issues where now everything got even more expensive to create. And it creates this vicious cycle. Now, if you follow Marty Kagan, he talks about long-lasting teams. He's a big believer in that. We're a startup. So for us, a long-lasting team is like a year, a year and a half at the most. But that's a big part of the value. He talks about it more from the user standpoint. Like, okay, you got a long-lasting team that really understand the user problems very deeply. But there's also something about understanding the code base very deeply from an engineering perspective. And we all know that engineers like to try out different problems, but there is a certain amount of time you need to spend with the code base. So we found that team, just through being together long enough, also started to break out of the cycle because they got more familiar. We started looking back at tickets that we missed in our retrospectives and going, hey, what went wrong here? And from that, we were able to learn very specifically, right, where we could get better and where we needed deeper understanding of the code base. And so we could be more targeted, and it really helped the team over that hurdle.
And precision accuracy, because I think that predictability component, especially if there's some type of technical debt that they have to pay down, as you're mentioning, every time they go back and do that, they're addressing, a quarter of their week to that. And all of a sudden, that predictability, there's going to be thrash in that. I think especially with code bases being different, I always talk about engineering as, it's using a programming language, it's using similar tools, there's all these things, but every time you create a new feature, unless it's something you've done before, there's a small nuance that it's almost something brand new that you haven't done or seen. Yeah, your toolbox is full of stuff you can pick up and do, but there's this pressure of trying to figure out something that you've never potentially had to do or seen or address and come up with an accurate estimate. I feel like asking the home contractor to come and tell you how much a new patio costs is one thing because he's pretty much reverse engineering, pure engineering skills versus software engineering. We call it engineering. So much invention that goes into it that it makes it really difficult.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's some of the reason why, when you are a manager and you're trying to put together a team, there are very specific things that you're trying to consider. This is not something where you just throw a bunch of people together. You're trying to put together experience diversity, skill diversity, so that hopefully you can overcome these issues. Because, yeah, maybe some of the newer engineers or the more junior engineers, they won't have the experience or the knowledge of code base to be able to get these accurate estimates together, but hopefully you can support them, whether it's on the team or with at a management layer, with people who can help them, maybe, bootstrap them into the process until they get more familiar. And I can't say we've always done that. It's hard, especially when you're growing really quickly. We started this year with, 30 engineers and now we're at 70. So we've more than doubled. And so, you certainly have scaling challenges. And I've also been in the place, unfortunately, my last company I worked at was having financial problems. They were having layoffs. I wound up in a scenario where I had a completely new team, everybody there less than 4 months owning code base. And we had to go do the archaeology type of thing. And that is just a miserable process. So you hope that you never get to that. And you hope that you can mitigate those risks up front. And that's why we put just an immense amount of effort into org planning.
That's a whole different idea to peel there, but I was curious to go back. When you guys are seeing team predictability and velocity and things are balancing and technology is evolutionary and all of a sudden there's a new piece of technology that's coming out that you can take advantage of, how much of your concern as a executive in engineering goes to, okay, am I going to affect what these guys are able to deliver by introducing this feature, technology, whatever it is from the outside that seems great, it will help, but the team will have to ramp up and it's a small step back.
I mean, a lot. I'm always very careful about introducing new technology. I try to use that word careful because I don't want to be, the roadblock. And I want to let engineers experiment. The trick is how do you make sure that they put the right amount of risk mitigation in place so that they don't do it, willy-nilly and wind up failing. I think actually one of the most difficult conversations is when somebody wants to introduce a new language. I find like frameworks, technologies, they're a little bit easier to talk about. For example, maybe you want to upgrade we're on Google Cloud, so maybe Google PubSub to Kafka or something like that. It's pretty easy to weigh the benefits and the whatever you're going to lose from that. It's always a little harder when you're talking about programming languages because there's just so much overlap. There's so much opinion about the way it looks and how it feels to just type it out. And that's one where I'm like, whenever somebody suggests it, hey, I get it. I'm certainly not close enough and I don't have to really live with the day-to-day of this decision. How can we put together some sort of plan to get us from, hey, this might be a good idea, to getting some amount of consensus or feedback from the rest of the team? And you're never going to get fully scientific, but also how can we break down some of the pros and cons here and make sure that we're doing this and it'll be an actual value add or not, one of the many languages that, companies I've been at have adopted and unfortunately have just become unmaintainable. Nobody knows the language and just winds up slowing everything to a halt.
Yeah, and worse, having different code bases, different languages, and that introduces a whole slew of hiring issues outside of just dealing with what a team can do. Because obviously, if people move around in teams, I mean, that's just a whole different level of Pandora's box right there, I think.
Absolutely. And I will say we've kind of stolen Marty Kagan's, he's got these 4 risks that he talks about, right? He talks about value risk, usability risk, feasibility risk, and business viability risk. And that's his way of breaking down the discovery problem when you're, looking at new features. I've stolen that and co-opted that for internal technology projects, for choices of technology. And it's just a nice framework for helping engineers to break down the problem of what they're trying to do. So let's say you are introducing a new, technology. Let's say it is Kafka or something like that. Is like, well, okay, value risk. Well, what is the intended value, and what are the risks of us not achieving that? How can we, predict that up front? Feasibility. What is it actually going to take to get this implemented? And then I think The other one I focus the most on, and I think it's the most underutilized risk for technology projects, is usability risk. Is that somebody is going to have to use this. If it's a language, they're going to have to learn it. They're going to have to use it in the wild. If it's a technology or a tool, like maybe you're implementing a DevOps tool, how easy is it for people to learn that and autonomously use that? And that step gets skipped so many times. So it's an area we focus a lot on because that's one of the biggest risks to failure of introducing a new technology is, just nobody even being able to actually utilize it.
I like how you outlined, Marty Kagan, the 4 risk areas. I think that's a great philosophy to kind of use to evaluate each individual case, because obviously lots of risk and opportunity as well. But that's where that balance comes in.
That's right. One thing and I don't know if this is where you were going to steer it or not, but one thing I wanted to mention, because you mentioned this early on and it didn't naturally go with the questions. You mentioned the balance between velocity and quality. And what I will say is that I think what we've learned, and I think what the industry is learning, is that you can actually have your cake and eat it too. And we've talked a lot about velocity and, in a way, introducing new technology, so maybe improving the quality, but at the risk of slowing us down temporarily. But it definitely used to be more of an equation when I started in the industry. At least that was my perception of it, was, the more time we spend on quality, the slower we get. And this is where I name dropped Nicole Forsgren, because I think one of the big things that she showed quantitatively is that the companies that are performing the best, the teams that are performing the best, the ones that are overachieving on commercial and non-commercial goals, have actually figured out the balance where they actually can get faster and improve quality at the same time. And they can quantitatively measure that. So that's something that we're always keeping an eye on and we're always working towards. And I think the solution is usually automation, which CI/CD DevOps is a part of.
Yeah, I think that's maybe where that balance is, like you mentioned, the CI/CD and DevOps principles are kind of, even DevSecOps, is once you're done with the sprint and you're actually releasing, deploying, you have high confidence. I think predictability and high confidence really means, I think what you were talking about, having your cake and eating it too, because then you feel pretty comfortable that the team can deliver at this velocity, at this quality. And then that's when the planning gets a little bit more fine-tuned, I think.
Absolutely. And when you read about it, there's lots of articles, books about it. It's one of those things that, developers love and they feel very proud about. And, you're trying to pave the way towards, but the path is definitely full of trials. The minute you have a month where you've got a whole bunch of outages, but you're releasing every single day, every developer's releasing every single day, it definitely makes you question, or even certainly the stakeholders around you go, should we really be releasing every day? Is this really a good idea? And of course, you got to problem solve that and make sure that you don't take a step back. And it also makes you realize that this whole thing is not automatic. There's lots of things you can measure that can help you find out how to adapt. There's lots of techniques you can adapt, but the nuance in the technique and making sure that they don't become something that's automatic, but something that people are still thinking about, like automated testing, which very often just becomes like a checkbox and everybody tries to get towards maximum code coverage, which is just not a great driving force. You have to make sure that everybody is still putting a good amount of thought in what can be, probably the most boring and rote part of the process.
Awesome, man. I'm cognizant of our time. I know you got to get back to it, and I think we could chat about this for a while, and hopefully we'll have you back on and talk about another topic down the road. But I really appreciate you being on and sharing your views and your time with us.
Absolutely. It was really fun. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And we'll include your LinkedIn profile in the show notes. If anybody wants to get in touch with Dave, follow up on any of the talking points, you can reach out to him and connect. Otherwise, again, thank you very much for being on. Super excited. And we look forward to being back again with another guest, another set of topics. I'm always asking you guys for 2 things. One, keep sending me the topic ideas, because that's the only way we can find guests to kind of talk about what you guys would like to hear. And keep subscribing to the podcast. It's really been growing organically and people are subscribing and the listenership's increasing. And it's been an awesome thing to see. And can't thank you guys enough. And until we come back again, see you then.